Of course, nice to meet some new people as well. So it's nice we have the chance to get together as security professionals, be able to review, to discuss, and in some cases, yeah, maybe get some ideas from other people as well. I have put together this presentation, as you know, entitled The Cyber Threats of 2026, the new risks, real business impact, and how to stay ahead. The idea behind this, of course, is so we can have a roadmap. We can have an idea. How do we want to set our goals for security, knowing that it's the old saying, if you're going to play tennis, the one thing about tennis is very different from golf. In golf, you only really ever play against yourself. It doesn't matter how well or how badly anybody else plays. It just matters how well do you hit the ball. But in tennis, it often matters. How well does the opposition play? How well do they, should you say, hit the ball and challenge us in that way as well? So for a lot of us, information security is the same, because it's not how well you and I do it. It's very much what are the, should you say here, adversaries doing? What is the environment in which we operate? How does that environment change? And of course, we talk about, well, 2026, but in many ways, a lot of what's going to happen this year is also what happened last year. And the one thing, of course, that keeps us busy is the fact that we are always needing to adapt to different types of situations and be able to confront the challenges we have. I like to follow Recorded Future and their briefs every day. And the one thing that's top of mind today is the number of Iranian-sponsored attacks that have happened now in the last few days against, you take, for example, the medical care provider and manufacturer, Stryker, who have had now thousands of their machines wiped as part of a ransomware attack. And attacks against critical infrastructure and so on. And we see that. We see that the threat environment changes, and very often driven by differences, say, geopolitical events. What's our challenge? Well, that's why we chose this industry, because it's never boring. There's always things happening, things going on that we can learn and benefit from, of course. When we take a look at the cyber threat world, of course, yeah, as I said, some of you know me, some of you don't, but I've been at this industry for a while now already, and do a fair bit of teaching for readiness, as well as some other, have a number of courses up on Pluralsight, for example, as well. But we do these webinars, and I think they're a wonderful thing to do here at Readiness, basically to provide additional value, a forum for us to discuss, but also gain a CPE credit for those of us that have certifications and need to prove that we're part of continuous learning in that as well. So this is all part of certainly what we've done at Readiness for many years, teaching over 60,000 students and 600 different courses that we've delivered over the years. And of course, those always change as well. When we see, for example, the Microsoft certifications, every time you sort of get a handle on them, they change a whole bunch of them and so on as well. So the taking a look at our content for today, I started with a report that I really like from some people I've worked with in the past, and with Team Cymru and so on, that are now with Expel. And this is their 2026 annual threat report. And we can say here, An in-depth look at how last year's attacks should inform, well, our defense strategy for today. We know that in many cases, hackers are not that innovative. Many types of malware and so on are just refinements of what's been done before. And we can see here that when the attackers have found something that works, they keep doing it. And why do they keep doing it? Why does it keep working? Because we're not always that good at being able to truly fix those vulnerabilities that allowed them in previously. And this comment from Greg Notch, the CSO at Expel, says, the gap between detecting a threat and actually doing something about it is where breaches happen. In many cases, we have seen something a bit different this year. This year already, we've seen more zero-day attacks than we did all of last year. So there is, and especially with AI and so on, there's a greater ability of the attackers to discover new vulnerabilities. But there's little we can do about, we could say here, a 0 day. In most cases, the 0 days are, there's no gap between detecting and being able to do something about it. But those are by far the minority of the cases. We can see that in most cases, even though there are some 0 days discovered and so on, the problem is that we actually know what we should do. And certainly when we take a look at this here, the gap between detecting and fixing, that is where we are vulnerable, because we know that when a gap is then, should we say, available, the vulnerability, the threat has been disclosed, then quite often there's a real focus or an emphasis by people trying to attack that. And so it brings it to the attention of the attackers, and therefore the risk associated with that vulnerability increases. So we have to be attentive. We talk about threat intelligence, and we need to be watching all the time. What are the areas where attackers are focusing? What are the technologies they're focusing on? And of course, we need to be aware of, we can say here, the tools and techniques that they are using as well. So we'll take a little bit of a look at that here. This is a comment that just came out yesterday again from CISA. CISA in the United States plays a key role in helping to secure US federal government, as well as passing on a lot of information that is good for all of us. But we know there's been several breaches over the past years with SolarWinds, and there's been the discovery of additional vulnerabilities with SolarWinds. And so patches have come out, and very often he said, you need to deploy these quickly. But what they actually have done now, of course, is they've actually said, no, this is more urgent than what we've said before. When we have these technologies that are such high-profile targets, and where there's such an emphasis by many cases, APTs, state-sponsored, or criminal organizations that are really focusing on these, yeah, we need to be that much more diligent to ensure that our patches are put in place. We have seen, for example, one attack done by Chatty Spider, and of course, when we look at the various naming conventions, we see anything that's Panda is usually Chinese-based. Russia, then of course, is Bear. The idea of Chatty Spider, we're looking really at many cases North Korean-based attacks. And one of the statistics that's so troubling about this is that we have so little time to respond once there's been a breach. In the case of the time between the initial access And when they were able to start exfiltrating data, it was only 4 minutes. It didn't take a long time to get initial access, move laterally across the organization and into other areas. And so that really emphasizes two things. One, we have to be better at prevention so that they don't get that initial access. Sorry. But also, we have to be that much better at detection so that we are able to notice right away, so that it's not such that we are relying on a person reviewing logs. That's far too late. But using some of the technologies we have, of course, helps. And CrowdStrike in their report brings out this, that when the attackers break in today, we've often talked about persistent threats. We've talked about, especially with, we can say here, when the motivation is the theft of intellectual property, that the attackers may be in there for, months, years, in there just exfiltrating data and so on. But one of the interesting reports out of CrowdStrike is that when an attacker initially gets in, until they're already done and they leave, is usually less than an hour. So it just emphasizes for all of us the importance of being able to respond quickly when these things happen. When we take a look at the CrowdStrike 2026 Global Threat Report, it's interesting how they entitled it for this year, the evasive adversary. The idea, of course, is that the adversary is fast moving. They're hard to find, and in many cases, hard to identify. So we, of course, see that it's not such that we even always know who the enemy is. That makes it much more difficult. I'm not just looking for one specific thing, but I'm looking for an adversary that is often moving around, changing tactics, and so on. And they put out this here, the Finnish intelligence warns of persistent cyber espionage from Russia and China. That is one of the main things they say that we need to watch for. And it certainly is, when we look at a number of the different attacks that have been going on, many of them are state-sponsored. I mentioned a few minutes ago, Iranian attacks, a lot of them just in the last few days. And one of the problems with these is that people say, well, what can we do about an advanced persistent threat? What can we do about a threat that is coming from, should you say here, a cyber army that is better funded than we are? And in many cases, not much. The reality is that these organizations have incredible talent and money behind them, and that's their job. This is something that they are doing because they're being paid to do it. So I can't necessarily stop them, but what can I do? I can make it difficult. I can make it, in many cases, such that it's less likely they will succeed. And so we know that these threats are out there. And of course, in many cases, we need to be able to confront them. But the reality is that the majority of attacks are not sophisticated. They're not new. They're not novel. This is, wow, the attackers have come out with some great new way of attacking. No, in most cases, they're using vulnerabilities we've known about for years. I think that report that comes from Deloitte that said that 20% of corporate devices that are connected to the internet are more than a year behind on their patches. And that is something that is troubling. Why is it that corporate devices are not being patched? Why is it that even though we know that is so critically important, Is it because, first of all, we don't even know what devices we have? We live in a world of shadow IT. We live in a world of bring your own device, sometimes better known as bring your own disaster. And so therefore, people are connecting, whether or not it's iPads or tablets or uh, phones and so on, that are insecure. And that's the problem is the patches, the antivirus signatures, and all these things are not being rolled out as they should. So that's the first place to start. Look for the things that we already can do something about. Every time we patch a system, we reduce the attack surface. We make that one, should we say, door that's shut that makes it harder for the attacker to get in. And so there's really two things that we've really covered there to begin with. Number one is make sure we know what we have, asset inventory, recovery scanners, compliance scanners, and then, of course, make sure that all of those devices are being, as we say, properly protected so that we don't see we make it easy for attackers to be able to exploit gaps that were entirely preventable and known. We saw that quote, the gap between the knowledge of it and the doing something about it is the problem, and especially when that gap is 2 years. We see in a number of cases of attacks where it exploited a system where the patch had been available already for 2 years. Why is that? Because we need to pay attention in many cases to not only looking out from the city wall and seeing what enemy is coming, but really paying that attention to look in and say, but how good are our defenses? And if I have unpatched, vulnerable systems, then our defenses are not very good. And this is a challenge I think we all face every day. You know, how do we actually keep on top of this? And I should say, address these preventable gaps. It's interesting, if we go back to Expel, that they say that it was through identities that 68% of all incidents were enabled. The attackers exploited user IDs, they exploited various types of identity management gaps that allowed them to take over, in some cases, just regular user accounts, but in other cases, privileged accounts. And privileged account management is critically important because the administrator accounts, the vendor default accounts, these are the ones that make the job really easy for the attacker. And yet, what do we see time after time? That we've seen the implementation of devices that still have vendor default accounts and passwords on them, and in many cases, not in IT. Because it's, you say, in IT, we often address the vendor accounts, but it's all the peripheral systems now that connect to our networks. Building management systems, Internet of Things, the idea of SCADA systems, industrial control systems. And the problem is that, in fact, here in Canada, where I'm from, we had a major bank that installed 4,000 ATMs, and the installation of those ATMs was done by a vendor, not by the IT department of the bank. And the problem was that every one of those ATMs still had the vendor supplied default access. You could walk up to the front of an ATM. You didn't even have to get access to the back. You could walk up to the front of the ATM. If you knew the right code for the PIN pad, you could basically turn that ATM into a video lottery terminal that, would start pumping money out. Why is that? Because we're connecting peripheral devices that in many cases are not managed by the IT group, but those are connected to our networks. They become an entry point. We have seen several cases with the point of interaction devices where you go to your the Presbyon or the little store by your house. You pick something up, you tap your credit card, and that little device that you tap your credit card on is called a point of interaction device. And those devices are built to be secure. Now, there have been breaches, I know, in the past of them, but in many cases, the majority of them by far are secure. However, again, they were installed by a vendor, and did the vendor then remove that, should you say, default password, that if an attacker is able to get onto our network, they can now compromise that device. And that device is connected in most cases to our corporate networks without proper network segmentation. I am a firm believer that network segmentation is a good thing. We have seen arguments about that. You take, for example, in a house. Some people like an open concept, and even in an office, there's open. But, sometimes it's really good to have walls and have doors. And in our network, it's the same way. If it's an open concept and a person standing at one end of the room can see everything right to the far end, there's no barriers, there's nothing to stop them from being able to get anywhere. Sometimes it's good, just keep people, the finances here, and they've got walls and doors around their department. Here, of course, is sales, and they've walls and doors around their department. Why? Just to protect against information flowing too easily from one network segment to another. And we can say the same thing here with identity. The problem with identity management is that it's very difficult to keep on top of ensuring that everybody's identity is following those principles of least privilege, need to know, that we are actively monitoring. But this is, of course, where we have so many great tools like user and entity behavior analysis, where we can also pick up, well, why is this person who normally only works during weekdays logging in at 2:00 in the morning? Yeah, that, of course, could be a clue that their identity has been compromised. And when we saw the attack against RSA, it was only of a person in HR. But the Chinese hacking group that compromised this person's account in HR, they were in on that user's identity for between 16 and 20 hours per day for over 6 months. And when I was talking with the vice president of security at RSA after that, he said, the one thing we learned is that there's almost nothing in our logs that indicated that. We are logging the wrong things. When it comes to identity, we should log who's on, when are they on? Is a person logged in for 16 hours a day? That's something that, of course, is a concern. It's interesting, though, that cybercrime, of course, has a huge impact. We've seen so much with ransomware and all this over the years. But the one thing we have to watch for is actually fraud. Fraud is the most common crime in England and Wales, accounting for roughly 40% of recorded crime. And for us in IT, we can say that fraud is not a cyber or a computer crime. A computer crime is a crime against a computer. Instead, fraud is a computer-enabled crime. We've had fraud for many years before we had computers. But in many cases today, fraud is easier because of computers. And so this is one thing that we always should watch for. Are we really diligent, since this is a high impact area? That if we look at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they say that most companies lose over 5% of gross revenue every year due to fraud. And for almost any company that you guys work for, if you could recover 5% of gross, that would be a lot more than your security budget for the next year. And so what do we need to do? Build in the controls, build in the logs that will enable us to certainly address this key area. And the problem with fraud is that most of this is internal. So it's what we talked about before. Yes, I need to stand on the wall of the city and look out where the enemy is coming from. But I also need to really look inside and say, how healthy are the controls we have in place? And one of the things we see most often with fraud, the controls were there. They just weren't working. And so when we review our security program, it's not enough just to see if the controls are there, but are they actually working? If somebody has a question or comment, please speak up. It's always welcome at any time. Makes the class a lot richer, I believe, too. So where are the gaps? Well, if we know that it's the gap between knowing and fixing is the problem, that's where we should find out where those gaps are. And of course, that's where we will look. What controls do we have in place? And are they really working? Because the majority of the attacks we will have this year will be based on known types of vulnerabilities. That it's not that and of course you're saying, like, I thought this class would be all about AI. I remember back, some of you remember when we had an attack called, it's many years now, 10 years ago almost, called WannaCry. There was that attack that came out called WannaCry, and you went to the next conference. And I remember one of the guys I worked with, he says, I'm at this conference, every speaker talks about WannaCry. He says, it just makes me want to cry. The tradition right now is everything is about AI. Okay, that's fine, but we will talk a little bit about it in a moment. But the reality is, there's no sense worrying about AI until we worry about the things we can fix, the things we know about. And this is difficult. I remember when I was delivering a report to a company, they'd want to give us a status of our security. I said, the problem with your security is not that you don't have the right tools. You have the right tools, but not a single one of those tools is configured correctly. Not a single one of those tools is doing what it could do. And that thing is but that's difficult to do. Why? Because we've got tools that, and I often look, I like SIMs. I know people say, oh, their SIMs are outdated. Yeah, but guess what? Everything we do is outdated, but the problem is that in many companies, the reason that a SIM doesn't work is because they don't have a single person on staff that knows how to actually manage and use it. When it was installed years ago, we had training, but nobody has actually now been trained that looks after this thing on a daily basis. And so a tool we pay a lot of money for doesn't actually work, quite simply because that deployed control, we can say here, is ineffective without proper administration, which is why that last bullet is so important. The reason for breaches is not because of a gap in the security solution. The technology is right. The technology, we have great technologies. Where's the gap? The gap is the administration of the technologies. And so that's an important thing for us to certainly focus on. It's interesting when we look at how many incidents of organizations had. On average, a small organization had 6 incidents per year. And which is one of the reasons why I often say that a challenge with something like a managed security service provider is that they have trained staff who are dealing with incidents all the time. Whereas a small company, I like that quote from Bruce Schneier. He says, "What is incident response in most companies? It's 3 weeks of boredom followed by 5 hours of sheer panic." Yeah, Simon would gladly make it available for you, the slides and so on. And so 3 weeks of boredom followed by 5 hours of sheer panic, and then followed up by several more weeks of boredom. I don't get good at incident management when I only deal with 6 incidents per year. And you can say, well, what's the problem? I don't get the training. I don't get the experience. I don't tune my abilities. So that's why for some companies, especially small ones, using an outside expert that is dealing with incidents every day can be a really good thing. Medium-sized companies were getting on average 24 per year. And of course, most large companies are dealing with more than 5 attacks per month. And so why? Well, they're a larger attack surface, many offices, and so on. And so in all of this, it's kind of, am I really watching, learning, and being able from each of these apply what is the advantage I can get to help me be better prepared, to be better at detection, to be better at response, and so on. Now, yes, we have to mention AI, of course, in these days. And the impact of AI is that AI has made the attackers better. They use AI to code attacks, and some of them are fairly good. Though, of course, those of you who have worked with AI, you've seen that it still takes a little bit of know-how and expertise to be able to take AI-generated code and clean it up and so on. But one of the main advantages of AI is the ability to automate the probing procedures so that we can set up an attack now that automatically will look for this, look for that. And one of those, of course, is fuzzing. Go against a web application and send at it bad data. But what we normally do is we send data that's at the edges. It's kind of fuzzy. You take, for example, the input for a web application. It takes the date. This is the year, date, month, day, for example. And so we try, for example, February 29th. We try September 31st. We try October 0. Fuzzing is to check whether or not our systems are precise enough to be able to know the difference between February 28th and 29th. Or does it sort of allow an invalid date? Is it not granular? We use the term granular for this, but not exact enough to be able to really determine what is good and what is invalid data. So one of the things that we've seen with AI tools is being able to do all of these many tests of just try the edges, try to see if there's a place where the boundaries were not set properly. And of course, that includes things like buffer overflows. What happens if I send more data at it than it was expecting? And of course, so AI has helped the development of some of the attack tools in this way. It's another thing that has been very interesting. You know, we've relied a lot on biometrics, especially we talked about a moment ago for identity management. And one of the things that we've seen is that some of the attacks now will go against the biometric systems and just obfuscate or they will alter so the fingerprint readers or palm scan readers are not as accurate anymore. They will instead create a greater, as we often call it there, a false acceptance rate. So that doesn't know the difference between my palm and somebody else's. And so it's one place where we've seen AI in development as well. Certainly, what does the AI do? It takes an average attacker and makes them more proficient, more skillful. It elevates a less sophisticated attacker to be able to do a more complex attack. The one thing too is that in many cases, to be a hacker was frustrating, because when the attacker spent months writing, for example, an attack, a tool they could use, they deployed that, and right away when the security community found out about that, they put in place fixes for that. So the lifespan of that attack in many cases was fairly short before it was fixed. And then to the frustration of the hacker, they have to start over. They have to refine their attack. They have to do it differently. And it took, in many cases, several weeks between one release of an attack and the next. Now, we see it very often as down to about 4 hours. It compresses the time so that when an initial attack comes out, the security community addresses the vulnerability. Then within 4 hours, the attacker already has refined the attack to be able to try to get around that new control. So that certainly is one area too, the AI-enabled adversary. It's good to go back and say, what is good practice? And the idea of MITRE Corporation, of course, those of you who've done the CISSP with me, you remember, for example, Dr. David Bell. Dr. Bell of the Bell-LaPadula model, for example, worked for MITRE Corporation for many years. And MITRE has put together the attack methodology. And the one thing that we really see is that it's not about response. It's about shifting left to be better at detection, shifting left to be better at prevention. And we need to try to deal with these things before the initial access is gained, prior to the execution, prior to the fact that they can escalate their privileges on our system. And it's about being proactive. Now, the problem with proactive is that how do you sell security if nothing happened? How do we convince management to take steps for something that might or might not ever happen? So this is where, I often like to say, security is not about selling technology. It's about selling sales. It's a sales course. How can we sell security to management so we get the budget we need? How can we put together a convincing, persuasive argument of why what you do every day is important, and of course that you should get the support you need to be able to do your job effectively. So a good reminder from MITRE on that. Work more on what, should we say, we can deal with. And going back to that analogy, we cannot do much about the enemy who's coming from outside, but we certainly can work with what is inside: our security controls, our identity and access management, our inventory and access management. We need asset management, I should say. We can deal with the things that are within our control. And it may not sound really, should we say here, wow, this is exciting. But in many cases, this is where the true effectiveness is going to be. So how do we address these problems of identity? Well, of course, we can see that multi-factor authentication is a good thing. In many cases, when attacks were noticed, they found that the attack was not successful because the attacker was not able to bypass or circumvent multi-factor authentication. Over half the time, that was an effective solution. Now, obviously, that still leaves a lot, but if we can reduce the success of the attackers by half, yeah, that's, should you say here, already going to have huge benefits in the fact that we can focus. We have also seen that there's been so much talk about phishing, and it doesn't matter how often we say it, certain people will still always fall for phishing attacks. And it's one of those things we have to keep top of mind. We saw a study done in California recently. They said through using phishing training, they actually only reduced their attacks or their, should we say here, the effectiveness of the phishing training only reduced their vulnerability by 5%. That's not very good. That's where we have to say, how can we make our training more impactful? How can we make sure that when we do phishing training, it's not just a routine, it's not just, but really so people understand, okay, this is, of course, a phishing attack. The other thing we have to watch for is, we can say here, people logging in from an IP address that's, should we say, not part of a normal address they log in from. It's good to be monitoring when people are trying to get access from an IP address in a part of the world where our user doesn't operate. But a very interesting one here was that a very large number of the attacks came from unauthorized VPNs. So whether it was from the Tor network or whether it's from, say, an Axios agent, the fact was that people attempted to log in through an encrypted pipe. And in doing that, were able to, in many cases, be more trusted. So the one thing, of course, we say with that is, you know, we should limit what tools our staff is using. That we don't just allow any type of tool to be used, even though VPNs are a good thing, only the ones that we say are, should we say here, recognized, and then of course also unrecognized devices. Yeah, maybe we do some type of filtering, that node authentication, and is this a device that is trusted that we should, of course, pay attention to. We've seen many attacks come from endpoints, vulnerable machines that are connected to our network, whether, as we looked at before, a point of interaction, or whether it's from a SCADA, industrial control system, building management system, the various laptops and so on. And in many cases, we can see here, this comes from malware that's on that machine, where that person is using it as their personal phone, also connecting to the corporate network. And mobile device management is a good thing. Having a sandbox, having isolation of our data. So hopefully as well, we don't end up with a malware infection in the case of Target. Their breach that came through their heating, ventilation, air conditioning system, their building management system, came because the vendor came in with an infected laptop. And the moment he connected to their air conditioning unit control panel, he passed the infection, the malware, that control panel, which then, because they did not have any network segmentation, spread to the rest of their network, production network. The other thing is that a lot of the cases are not APTs. An advanced persistent threat is one that's very often targeted. We're trying to get into that, should we say, company or that type of hardware. Instead, the majority of the attacks have been from somebody who's just looking and finds a weakness and takes advantage of that. We call those opportunistic attacks. They were just looking and they said, hey, oh, look at this. Here's a company that's unpatched. Here's a system that's misconfigured. And they weren't necessarily targeted. They were quite simply just happy to find someone, and they didn't care who it was, that they could then launch their ransomware and so on. There are definitely targeted attacks as well, and that's where we have to look. And we looked at SolarWinds earlier. When we see an attack that comes out against a certain technology, the first thing we should do is really check, do we have that technology? And that's not just a quick question, it's really probing and asking, because it could be that we didn't think we had that technology, but in reality, we did. It had been installed years earlier, or it, for example, was in another department. And so we need to check, do we really have those? So I don't become a victim of something which already has been known about. When we look at, for example, one of the most common attacks out of North Korea, as we said, anything that talks about spider is, we looked at chatty spider, scattered spider. And these attacks come from North Korean groups. And one of their main ways of doing attacks these days is the voice phishing. People getting a phone call and responding to that, whether or not that call is about their supposed fraudulent transactions on their credit card, or their machine is infecting the internet. And you have a person that then calls in, and it looks like it comes from a local number. It doesn't come from a number in North Korea. But the point, of course, is they become vulnerable, they're easily convinced. And these, we often said, were really against the seniors, but that's not true. The two main groups affected by these are the seniors, yes. Those who are over 70 and are a little more trusting, and if somebody calls them, they sound official. And don't forget, these guys are con men, or in most cases, it's women's voices, actually. But the other group that's affected most by that these days, the 16 to 25-year-olds. Because these are the ones that are used to social media, they're used to influencers. And so one of our main areas of working on phishing has to be in that the new employees group, and convince them of how to be able to detect and resist phishing. We also seen something, and of course, here we are using Microsoft Teams, a good product and so on in many ways. It's interesting when we see how many patches come out on Microsoft now. But in many cases, the attacks have been persistent in that the attackers are in there using a technology for months as the platform for being able to launch attacks. And so it's we do see that, and of course the risks associated with that. One of the main types of attacks we have to train people on is what we call the click fix. A click fix is when a person gets this thing and says, hey, your machine's infected, click on this link to verify your credit card transactions, or click on it, yeah. And in many cases, these actually run on malicious captchas, those wonderful, choose all the pictures that show a motorcycle. We show you one here. Complete these verification steps. To prove you're not a robot, please press and hold the Windows key and R. So what should we do? Disable Windows Run. There's no reason for most people to have that active on their machine. So what does it do? It reduces the attack surface. It's one more thing that even if they tried to do, would stop the potential attack. And of course, the one thing too is only allow approved software. You take one good example right now is like free PDF readers. And right away, when the person wants to download a PDF and maybe they need to edit it and so on, it says, here are free readers you can use that allow you to modify PDFs for free. One of them, Supreme PDF, is one that's been very much used in attacks, because what does it do? The moment a person downloads this, starts to use it, it creates backdoors that allow for the exfiltration of data on their systems. So make sure that all of our staff, employees, know here is use this approved product. And it's not just PDF, but many other products as well, where we actually designate what are the acceptable products to use, whether or not it's an API and so on as well. We do see cloud-based attacks increasing. The intrusions through cloud-based systems rose 37% last year, but most of this is APTs, state-based, state-sponsored. China, for example, has had a 38% increase of the attacks we see are cloud-based, because cloud is such an important part of our supply chain today. Most of our organizations are using some cloud services, and of course that creates a new attack surface that the attackers are very pleased to go after. And it's important, as it says here, the attacks in the cloud very often were abuse of valid accounts. A person who had an account on the cloud was able to be used by, as you say here, another person, unauthorized person. So these are things that we certainly have to watch for. 35% of breaches of cloud service came from user accounts that were not properly, should you say, managed and were able to be exploited. So we see many intrusions succeed simply because we didn't do the basics as well as we need to. And therefore, the attacks of 2026 are going to, in many cases, be a continuation and an evolution of the attacks of previous years. And so we need to really work on things like using multi-factor authentication, making sure we use proper configurations, and optimizing the security tools we have. So, any questions, any comments? I put you all to sleep, did I? Oh, well. So, hopefully, many of you are subscribed to our unlimited training licenses. These you can take, as many security and Microsoft courses as you like. So that's a great advantage for you to continue your learning journey, which I think is always really important. We need to have a focus on continued learning, and I think that's important here. And of course, with all of this, hopefully I'll get to see you again then sometime in a class as well. So thank you all very much for the chance we could spend together. If you have comments, be glad to hear them. And as far as it goes, the good luck to you. What you do is important. And so hopefully you find some, should we say here, some information you can use. And of course, one more CPE credit for your certifications.